But does blowing glass make you a better scientist?
Yes. That one's yes. That it goes that direction, but not the other, which is hilarious to me. Ding! Arts education is the answer.
This is Arts Educators Save the World, where successful artists and their mentors talk about how arts education transformed their lives. Welcome back to Arts Educators Save the World, a podcast where we talk to artists and their mentors about the impact of arts education on both their lives. And today, we are going to travel from the elementary and high school classrooms that we've been hanging in to the land of the university. So specifically, we are traveling to the very first academic glass art program in the United States, right here at my home institution of the University of Wisconsin at Madison, and specifically a glass art education program that counts world-famous glass artist Dale Chihuly as an alum. If you have heard of one glass artist, it is likely Dale Chihuly. He is a large-scale sculptor of glass art. His work can be seen all over the world, including at big fancy hotels in Las Vegas. If you've ever been to the Bellagio, that is a Dale Chihuly, among other giant world-famous spaces. So this program here at UW-Madison is very storied, and quite well known. And you may recall our conversation with Carlos Gacharna a few weeks ago and his mentor, ceramicist Jeff Herman. Carlos talked a little about going on to study 3D art here at UW and mentioned Helen Lee and the Glass Lab as one of his foundational higher education practices. And so I am thrilled today that we are going to get a chance to hear more from world-famous glass art educator Helen Lee and her mentee and art scientist Aaron Bossen. They are both contemporary artists, so think more in the modern art space, who work in glass and consider themselves glass educators, which we learned is a little bit different from being a glass artist, because you have to also consider how you are going to teach people to do this hands-on, craft-based art making that cannot be learned without people working together to make something.
I think our listeners are very lucky to have heard your introduction before the interview. I did not have that experience. I had to just go right into the interview. And I'm fascinated that we're all carbon-based life forms. And yet there can be people who are not just interested, but expert in something that is as foreign. I mean, I'm drinking from a glass. I think that's the same. I think I'm in the same zone. But yes, their brains and their artistry work in such different ways than mine that it was fascinating to hear. And I dig that they both kept going into the science of things and going down the rabbit hole. They couldn't sort of help themselves. And I'm all for it. I'm all for staying in that rabbit hole.
Yeah, these two are real smarties and very well-versed both in conceptual art, like contemporary art, where you think about what the foundation of the art you make, what that means, and how what you're making communicates something bigger than the thing itself. And they both have backgrounds in material science. So they're fascinated both by the things they make with glass and how glass functions as a material that you can make with.
When I just called us all carbon-based life forms, that was like a guess. That's the most science I'll give you, and I'm not even sure if I was right. But yeah, let's do this.
Let's get into it. Today on Arts Educators Save the World, we are diving into the wonderful world of art science, which is the use of both artistic and scientific methods in combination to explore and express the human experience. I can't think of a more fitting artist to talk with than artist-scientist Aaron Bossen. Aaron is a glass artist who manages the glass studio at Penn State University, where he is also a PhD student in materials science engineering, specializing in, you guessed it, glass. Aaron's research involves both the study of glass as a material and the making of glass art. So he's asking questions about how glass functions as a material and using that knowledge to make art. And similarly, his work making art informs the questions he asks about the physics of glass. This is a brand new venture for Alec and for me. Aaron, we are so thrilled to have you. Welcome to Arts Educators Save the World.
Well, thank you so much. It's kind of hard to find a place to ply my trade, so to speak, when you have as many hats as I do, and you're saying I'm an artist, I'm a scientist. So I was really excited to, have this opportunity to share kind of a unique perspective and share it with someone who helped me find it, alongside someone who helped me find it, Helen.
Well, let's bring her into the conversation.
So Helen Lee is one of my two glass professors that started me on this sort of path into glass art, and we can go into that. But Helen's currently the associate professor and head of glass at UW-Madison, as well as the director of the Glass Education Exchange, or GEEX, which is a sort of space for exchanging information and resources and sort of personal perspectives on glass and art and craft. And it's been really important as a source and space for that. For me as a scientist, sort of, plumbing glass art from outside the discipline, it's really nice to have that space. Helen also was nominated recently as a 2024 United States Artist Fellow, which is very prestigious and just means some ongoing support for her work. And also Helen's just wrapping up a year-long celebration of glass in Madison. Glass Madison, in its many facets and forms, has been a big celebration of all that Madison and UW-Madison has offered to the glass art space and the craft space, specifically through the explicit lens of glass, pardon the pun. And I was just, pleased to occupy the same studio space for a short time as Helen and learn as much as I could from her. And I'm hoping that we can have a just wonderful conversation about glass today.
Awesome.
Thanks for inviting me here. That was a really thorough introduction. Thank you.
Well, this podcast is about art making, but it's also about mentorship. And so one of the reasons I was really excited to have the two of you on together is because in getting to know you both a little bit, I learned about the kind of unique relationship that you've had to one another in terms of thinking about glass making and the communities around glass art and the science of glass and why that matters for art making and why it matters for learning. And so I was hoping we could start by each of you telling us the story of the first time you remember working together. And it's okay if that's not the same story, but I want to kind of start at the beginning of your collaborative journey.
I know they're not going to be the same. I definitely know they won't be the same, which is great. I can start.
You go first then.
Yeah. So I entered into UW-Madison as a freshman. I come from rural Northwest Wisconsin. And so if you come from that space and you're good at science like I was, it's sort of a natural inclination to go towards engineering. Mechanical engineering is also kind of the one that you go to if you spend much of your childhood fixing tractors and things like that. So I entered as a mechanical engineer, but then quickly found materials science and engineering as sort of the more suitable discipline. And material science is all about studying what a material is and how we understand it. And as part of that, my advisor, academic advisor at the time, when I was just a freshman, sent out this email to the whole department that said, hey, you might be interested in this class across campus on the full other side of campus from engineering. It's glass blowing. And they were also advertising the neon bending course at the time, but I was really grabbed by the glass blowing, and I saw, okay, email Helen Lee to, find out more. And I said, hey, I want to be in this. What do I have to do? And she said, you have to wait for all the art students to enroll first. And I said, that's not going to happen, is it? This seems like a popular course. But that was my first interaction. And then that set me down a path to say, okay, I'm going to make it so you can't deny me from this class. You have to let me in. I followed the prereqs. I am an art student now, and so I can take this class. And so it was like, okay, I'll see you in a few years then. If I have to go out this other route, I'll see you in a few years. And that was my first interaction, albeit small and via email, but that was like the first touch point. And that fully sent me on a path that like circled back until senior year. I didn't revisit glass until, a few years later.
Wow, that is very different than my memory. I don't remember that, although I do remember actively kind of spreading the gospel of glass and neon classes to engineering, which I guess sort of the art department thought was weird, or like they're always like, oh yeah, Helen's doing that thing where her classes are all full of non-art majors, and that's so weird. And so I kind of, remember like going outward in that direction. But the first time you were actually in the glass lab proper, I was not the instructor. I was in sabbatical year. And so you worked with my sabbatical replacement, Dylan Palmer, who's an amazing glass instructor. And I kind of knew that you were like under his wing. And I remember, just sort of having a good impression of like his mentorship role with you. And it wasn't until the following year, and this is sort of an interesting dynamic because my sabbatical year was also the COVID pivot year. And so I was a little bit distanced from the immediate crisis of, oh my God, how do you teach hot glass virtually? And what am I supposed to do? And I got to kind of like skirt that a little bit. In fact, that was a large impetus of what initiated the nonprofit Geeks that I work with. But I didn't really work with Aaron hands-on until the following year, which in some respects was the most challenging year because on one hand, we were one of the very few classes that was given permission to meet in person, but we had to be masked and we had to be quote unquote 6 feet distant, which if you've ever watched two people blow glass, that's not a thing. So there was a lot of creativity around it. And also, I remember that year, every year, in the capacity as a university professor, there's sort of your research and your teaching and your service. And I just remember that year being like, okay, especially for my graduating class, which happened to be like all 12 of my advanced students happened to be graduating seniors that year. I just remember being like, these poor kids, the teaching is going to be number one this year. Like, we are all in this space where like the glass lab is the one place we all have permission to go to outside of our homes. Like we're just all going to go all in. And so Aaron is kind of part of that like COVID moment cohort. And then in particular, what I remember specifically about working with him, I had split that group of 12 up into 3 different categories of like who needed to brush up their studio projects and who needed to brush up their technical chops and who needed to brush up. I can't remember what the third thing was, but Aaron was in the category of like, we're going to drill down your bowls. Your bowl form needs improvement. and like, that's the sort of technical hand skill kind of transference that I really remember having with Aaron.
And for listeners for whom glass art is a brand new idea, I mean, obviously, I think a lot of people can picture what a blown glass piece of art looks like, but I think the process of, and you called it hot glass, Helen, that process is probably unfamiliar. So can you say a little bit about how hot glass making works, and maybe even specifically, Aaron, a little bit about this particular technique that Helen was just describing of like, oh, you need to work on that. For folks who maybe have never been in a glass lab or never seen hot glass be blown before.
Well, nowadays there's this really convenient pop culture reference, which is a reality TV show called Blown Away on Netflix. And so you can just navigate over to that and check it out. But in
Not
essence,
sponsored by this podcast, but they could if they wanted to.
They could.
But in essence, I mean, at its sort of most crude description, there is, however many 100 pounds of molten glass in a crucible, and you wind it up on the end of a blowpipe, and you have this like molten goo that you somehow manage to figure out how to actually control and shape between heat and gravity and the forces of your tools and centrifugal force, etc.
Yeah. And making a bowl with that is very difficult, I'll say. I think art glass blowers among the craft disciplines, I think, have this like very intense sort of investigation of form. So when you make something with intention about every part of it. And so when you make a bowl, you want to see that there's this continuous curve all the way from the base of it all the way up to the lip. And usually you don't want it to be as tall as it is wide and all these other proportional things. And so I was making square bowls where it's about as tall as it is wide and they're fairly thick, and they're for a glass blower, it's not refined or good. And I remember too, like, recognizing that I had acquired a bunch of skills, but not very much technical proficiency in any of them. And so I remember when Helen and I started, working together and she was giving me feedback, it was like, yes, okay, let's do this. Let's make like a really good bowl. Let's, hammer down on what that means. There was a lot of satisfaction there, but there's also this aspect of receiving something that you made and sweated over with black Sharpie all over telling you where you went wrong is like, it's a very immediate critique that you can see what you did wrong. And then you can, grow from that, which is like, that's how Helen typically gives feedback is writing on the piece, which is probably the most effective way. But I made so many bowls and got so much feedback.
Is that typical, Helen, or is that your own brand of feedback? Or is that what glass teachers do?
It might just be me. Like, when I think back, I can't actually pinpoint anybody else that did that to me, which is that true? I mean, I had instructors that would sit and look at our objects and speak aloud, especially in front of a group, all the things they observed, but stop shy of actually marking it up. And at Madison, certain other glass programs are full-on departments, and so they might have one whole course that's just glass blowing. But at Madison, it's different, where we are one corner of an art department, and I have one beginning class, which is a survey class, and one intermediate advanced class. And people that really want to focus on it just kind of repeat that advanced class to accrue the credits needed. And so I have really limited time to get across all the things. So the luxury of being able to sit in a group with 12 students and look at all their pieces and collectively chat about the pros and cons of each piece, it doesn't really exist bandwidth-wise. So I would kind of do that same thing, but then mark it up as though it were, like Google Doc comments or whatever, but Sharpie on glass.
And this is a super naive question, but once you make a ball, it's done, right? Like you can't go back in with something, right? It's like you can't refire a piece of clay once it's been fired.
Nobody does that. Yes, theoretically you could, and maybe some people do that in kind of an artistic pursuit, to say something about process, but practically speaking, not so much.
Got it.
What's really refreshing to me as a theater major, as a director, is the notion that, I don't want to quite use the word rules, but you talked about a bowl should be proportionally its width compared to its height, and there's, we can give a general, like, this is better than, when I'm dealing with like how I talk to humans, it's harder for a teacher to really give you some really nice limitations to work within, but they're really helpful. It's great, even though we know it's art. And of course, the rule isn't, it can't be, so wide and so high, but there's a general feeling of this is kind of how we do it. My first question is very specifically on this. Why? Where does that measurement limitation come from? And are there other ones? And do you like that? Is it helpful to work in an artistic realm where a teacher is simply saying, "Don't do it that way. I'm gonna box you in a little bit here, just so that we can move on to the next step"?
on the sort of why do we do that? It's, I think, a preference in large part for certain forms and certain shapes that are historically or culturally seen as maybe more important or more refined. But like you said, those rules are only rules with air quotes. Like, you can still make a bowl and have it contain a stew and eat out of it and whatever. But I think that constraint, and like applying a modest constraint like that and saying, no, you can do better. No, I think you can do better. I think that's extremely valuable to say, I see what you've tried to do here, and I'm going to cache it in this space of, okay, bowls, or okay, cups, or whatever you're trying to do. Maybe it's theater and you're trying to put together production. I think it's extremely important to understand, like, okay, here's where my bar is maybe for this single piece, and here's where I could go, and let's try to go there. What's not to say we can't go further? So I think like the constraint there is maybe self-improvement to some extent, and say like, this glassblowing effort is not one and done. It's modeled sort of on production where you're making maybe 100, maybe 200, and they need to be identical. And so there's also that bar to prove. So it kind of goes, in an educational sense, putting constraints is valuable, but also historically it goes back to some production standards and saying all of these bowls were made by hand. They all need to look the same. And, the designer has certain forms for that.
I think there's something to be said, too, about the context of technical skill in the pursuit of one's artistic studio practice, because I would liken these sort of technical exercises in like vocabulary building or vocal range, where it's like, can you actually achieve a certain gamut, technically speaking? And then when it comes to actually performing out your own work, is it appropriate for you to use that range? Is it appropriate to have this certain degree of tolerance? Like we've been tossing around words of like good, right, or bad, or a certain proportion, but that's all within the kind of like certain perspective of like technical skill acquisition, which is a helpful range to have within one's toolkit, but then knowing when and when not to apply it is like a whole other ball of wax, and that's kind of the other half of the education at the UW Glass Lab.
In my book, I talk about this idea of what I call meta-representational competence, which is the notion that good art making looks at the relationship between the idea you're trying to communicate and the role that particular tools have in communicating that idea, and that sort of advanced art making looks like an understanding of the relationship between those two. So in video editing, right, it's not just about knowing all the different tools that you have available to you, but understanding that when you are trying to communicate anxiety, quick cuts between images is one such tool that affords you the opportunity to do that. And I hear sort of a similar thing in what you're describing, Helen, which is that to learn the role of the tools, you have to take practice with those techniques, but possibly not in a total vacuum, right? Where you're just like, no, again, no, again, no, again.
Well, I mean, for instance, we've centered this conversation like from the origin point of, how do we remember working together? What are like the hands-on skills we remember? But if I stop and think about Aaron's studio work as an artist, like there's not a bowl in sight, like bowls had nothing to do with his artwork, but they were a calisthenic that he practiced as a way of having fluency with the material. And that connective tissue, I think, was really important in arriving at his actual artwork. So I just didn't want us to be misled. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not a bowl maker.
Let's talk about your artwork and your practice, Aaron, and how do you describe yourself as a glass artist? When people ask you, "Oh, you're a glass artist," what does that mean? How do you talk about your work?
A lot of my work is sort of asking questions about like what story is told and why are we only getting a fragment of it. So in my artistic practice, it's sort of looking at family histories, looking at informational histories, and seeing where those kind of peter out or are like their weakest. I come from a family that's intensely Midwestern and very old and very small, so that things are held close to the chest. Very few people hold them, and they're not very willing to like share them generationally. And so my practice is, looking at this sort of family lineage information and like who did what in these times before I was alive. I uncover these sort of happenstance connections. Like my great grandfather played saxophone, and I didn't know that until I had been a saxophone player for a decade. Or I had a family friend who went into the same field of material science as I did and was in the field for, his whole career. And I didn't learn about this until I was already halfway through my degrees. Like these things where you can provide the information or the story to the audience that should, it's most critical to. But if you're not providing the story, they're at a loss. And those connections are incredibly important. And I'm sort of speaking very broadly because I think about this in terms of education, in how you communicate your knowledge to a student, but also how you sort of communicate your family lineage knowledge or your technical knowledge across generations. And so it's this idea of how do we ensure that those connections are strong and that they're maintained, and so that it's not just strong in one generation, but that's maintained to the next one and the next one and the next one.
And do you make glass pieces that represent that concept of connection?
Largely, yes. Like I haven't made work that focuses on this in a while because I've been strictly teaching people how to make glass. But a lot of my work at UW was sort of examining the self and examining memory and examining impression and sort of how information is put out and then received back, or put out and received by another. So I did a lot of material studies of encapsulations. The best example of this sort of memory is I made a series of saxophone mouthpieces in glass that were kiln cast, so just sort of cast into molds. I played on them, musically. I played a few pieces on each one, and then I took each mouthpiece and sandwiched it in hot glass so that you can see the piece, you can see the mouthpiece, but sandwiching it in hot glass breaks the piece. And then there's this sort of distance between you and the actual memory, so to speak. And this idea of like memory being intangible and there, but also changed by its preservation. Like you remembering something changes every time. So it's this like distance between the information you have and the information you want to have, distance between like your current and your memory, some ideas like that. But it's a hard thing to do in glass, I think, because glass is somewhat like resilient, somewhat permanent in a certain way. But yeah, it's my practice is largely to do with how do we teach better? How do we maintain that lineage of information in so many ways?
I'm just so curious how you think about the connective tissue between that which you explore in your own work and your practice now as a glass educator, because so much of that transference of knowledge is similarly an oral tradition, but also so embodied.
Yeah, I think glass and the crafts, sort of like the three-dimensional physical crafts like ceramics and metals to some extent as well, have this tradition of like people know how to make that stuff. I don't know who they are, but there's people out there who know how to make that. Like I remember going to craft fairs with my parents and seeing some of this work and just like being really impressed, and then walking away and just going like, that exists, cool, like thumbs up. But like having no impression of what the ecosystem is for the people that learn how to do that. Like, I don't know. I think there's so many hobbyists that don't give themselves license as artists. Like, hobbyist woodworkers that never sell anything, which is fine for the record. But I think like there's not a very sustaining culture of handcraft in America. And I think that's kind of where I see this being important is we understand technical materials really well. We can make systems to make bottles and automate different glass manufacturing things, but that doesn't maintain the sort of soul of glass working and the soul of making it by hand, which is still important in so many industries. And so I think like as a glass educator, it's coming as a glass scientist coming in and saying, look at these other people in glass. They matter too. Their voices matter too, because many glass scientists have little to no appreciation of glass art as a technical practice. Like they appreciate the artistic side, but they're not really seeing and going, there's really good material understanding happening there. And I think it's I see it as my job with the sort of position I've set for myself as saying, no, that's really important. They need to understand our perspective, and we need to understand theirs, sort of the glass scientist versus glass blower exchange there.
My name is Graham Isidore. I have a progressive eye disease called keratoconus. Admitting I'm losing my vision has been hard, but explaining it to other people has been harder. Lately, I've been trying to talk about it. Short-sighted is an attempt to explain what vision loss feels like by exploring how it sounds. By sharing my story, we get into all the things you don't see about hidden disabilities. Short-sighted from CBC's Personally, available now.
What strikes me, Erin, about your perspective is how, not that it is, in my understanding, directly your perspective, Helen, but how a conceptual approach to glass art is, I don't know if that's unique among glass educators, but it is certainly something I see in your approach and your students, and seeing Aaron develop his own conceptual approach to glass art feels very much like he is of a generation of your making. And I don't know if that resonates with you, or if you would say, no, that's how glass art education is. Well, and I just have a very narrow perspective because you are the person that I know.
So I think it has more to do with where we are in the history of glass art in academia. Because there's many different ways to enter into the field. One might apprentice with somebody. One might work in a production shop. One might, start in flame working. And one might discover glass, as many do, in academia, because the origins of working as a glass artist in America, at least, have its origins like right here at UW-Madison, where this was the first academic glass art program in America. It comes with all of the, pros and cons of academia. And in terms of there's just such a huge, vast range of what type of things get made in glass and what is called art in glass. But what you will commonly find in the academic spectrum nowadays are practices that are really pretty conversant with the greater field of contemporary art and conceptual art that happen to use glass as a medium, where people are equally well versed in the craftsmanship that you would find, in a more trade-oriented environment. And so the particular flavor of glass making that gets practiced here, yes, comes from a very academic trajectory that ties into a much larger field of contemporary craft practice and contemporary art. My role in that is definitely reflective of a certain lineage, but I don't really think my own fingerprint has as much influence as just the moment that we're in.
Mm. And is there a lineage that you point to for yourself? In other words, mentors that you had or ways of working that you learned?
Well, one thing that I think is kind of important in even your curated selection of Aaron and me, Erica, is that we both sort of have that. I mean, Aaron has mentioned, I can't remember what vocabulary he used, but we both sort of have this non-traditional path into glass art, right? Where Aaron's primary playground was material science, and then he entered into glassmaking from that. And I'm not too distant from that in that I was an architecture student at MIT. So the most engineering rich, technically oriented environment you could possibly imagine. And that's where I happened to pick up my glassblowing chops, just in the basement, because the material science department offered it as an extracurricular activity. And so I learned glassblowing alongside all the engineers, and that was normal to me, And so when I say that, in that first year that Aaron was a student while I had someone else as a sabbatical replacement, I knew Aaron was on premises. I knew Aaron was coming from material science. And what that immediately triggered was like my mental knowledge of all the other people over the last 2-3 decades that have had that hybrid of expertise, right? Immediately, I was like, okay, Aaron needs to meet Andrew Bernot. Aaron needs to know who Joshua Praselsky is. Aaron needs to like meet Dr. Jane. You know, there was like an immediate trajectory of like, and that's it, you know? Like that is it in terms of people that occupy that particular Venn diagram. And so perhaps it's worth noting that I think I had an ability to speak to Aaron's particular intersection of interest because I had so much literacy and fluency from having come from a highly technical background. And it's like hot and cold too, because like, yes, it was a highly technical environment, like being at MIT and learning glass blowing. But on the other hand, it's also like, and everyone just made glass pumpkins, you know? And it's just like this weird hot and cold of like, what's high tech, what's low tech, what's accessible, what's not, what is thought of as art, what isn't, you know? It's like this big, weird, hot mess that, you know, you just move through life and stitch together all these different experiences and pick and choose what actually becomes your own practice or not. But I think my background in growing up in the MIT Glass Lab, like definitely kind of has informed my perspective in how I occupy space in this field. But in the case of relating to Aaron, I also think enabled me to like really give him some connections that were helpful.
I have 2 questions here. The first is, maybe this is, of course, self-selecting from Erica's casting of this episode, but you two are freakishly well-spoken on your topic. I mean, I listen to you, and it's just this beautiful collection of words to describe your work, how you think about your work. Is this typical of glass blowing? Is this a world, or are most
For people who are listening, Aaron just vigorously shook his head.
Because are there people who are like, dude, man, I'm just blowing glass, man? Like, have we walked into an art form where everyone walks down the street sounding like you, or no? Are you kind of special? You sound special to me.
I have a perspective on this, which is
Please.
One, Helen's work is intensely focused on language, and some of that is deeply in her practice. And my dad was an English major, and my mom's dad was a PhD in creative writing at the U of M. To answer that question, I think both Helen and I are just like very much in the verbose side of glass. And there are other people like this, but like I think it's not representational of the entire field.
Yeah, and I would say again, it's maybe symptomatic of the particular space that we're in, of like contemporary glass art education and academia, and especially actually at UW, because one of the strengths at UW is their program in material culture. And I think that's definitely kind of informed the flavor of contemporary craft education here, where for myself, it doesn't feel like enough to just transfer hand skills, but I really actually think it's critical that these glass students are also thinking about the material culture of glass and their personal relationship to that, and that they're able to speak to that like well, you know, and expansively too. And I think it's one of the reasons why we have like, you know, like glass students in every corner of like every department here being like, oh, geologist, what are you doing with glass? Or, you know, like name your department. And we've got a glass crowd like being nosy, asking like how glass plays out in that discipline. Right. But it's part of like the culture of like, what is nerdy glass academia into these days? And part of that is like, well, thinking about the practice a lot, thinking about what it means to have these skills and what's the relevance of that, you know?
Well, actually, what you just said about the other folks you have in your class leads me to my second question, which is, what would you say is your essential metaphor of what glass is? I mean, to me, I'm seeing, how is glass like life? Let me ask it that way. How is glass like life?
God.
Because that's what I'm here for. That's what I'm
an exhibition title.
I don't actually know. By the way, you're. I don't actually know anything. I just like to ask questions like this. But you know, as a poker player, as a baseball player, as a director, I could tell you how my things are life. And with glass, I feel like there's some things that are obvious to me, that there's something about being able to see through it, but not perfectly, that it's both a solid, but also easily broken. I could do all those things. Is there like a 101 that like, everyone in the glass world kind of, we're past that. But for you, how is glass like life? That is my question of the day.
Well, I don't think there's a standard answer to that. And I'm also really interested in everyone's individualized answer to that. And I have one to offer, but I'm also going to cue Aaron because he said something in a conversation we had earlier that was really lovely, which was like, and I'm going to do a terrible job of butchering this, so you please take over and reframe. But it was something to the effect of like, glass is like the one material that defines itself by what it isn't. Like it is.
Yes.
Right? Yeah, go.
Okay. I have two answers to this. I have to put on my science hat. My advisor, would be looking at me shamefully otherwise. So from a glass science perspective, from this like very specific technical definitional space of, glass science, glass is a non-crystalline, non-equilibrium material. So it's not ordered like a ceramic. And it's not anything that it wants to be, non-equilibrium, and continuously relaxes towards the supercooled liquid state, which means that over time, glass will flow very, very slowly. So the origin of church windows being thicker at the bottom has a very small grain of truth in that glass flows. But at room temperature, in a pane of glass, it would only flow about a nanometer over 1 billion years. About as wide as DNA is. So the reason church windows are thicker at the bottom is because of glass blowers, not because of glass flowing. Now, my other answer, like that's the very technical answer that I can give in a lecture. But because I stand between these two fields of science and art, I get a lot of questions of like, so what is glass? People come up and like hands on their hips. So what is it? Tell me.
My hands are on my hips. I need the captions to figure out what you just said before.
So you're supposed to know this. And so what I tell, the general public or like students that are outside of sort of prescript glass science is it's a very thick liquid that doesn't want to be what it is. That's it. That's all. Like that's all you really need to know over the time. And that's like totally juvenile, to describe it as it's a thick liquid, but like that's about as much as you can communicate generally. And like that's pretty accurate too. If you could get honey to flow a little bit slower and before it like completely crystallized, it would be just like blowing glass. And so there's a lot more things like the term glass is as specific as the term metal because you can turn any liquid into a glass if you cool it fast enough. But the thing Helen said earlier about like glass being a material defined by what it isn't is 100% true. There's about 8 categories that glass falls outside of and not inside of. And so it means studying it is difficult, but it also gives this like nebulous, undefinable quality to glass as a material when you're working with it, especially when it's molten. It's just like nothing else really. I mean, it's like glass. It's like other glasses, but that's kind of, it's hard to define without using the word glass. And I think that's also really interesting.
And I think like my more, how do I describe this? Less technical, more colloquial version of that is to say that glass is elusive. And part of that is what keeps me hooked as a glass maker. And I'll always go back to perhaps like an erroneous metaphor here, because one of the there's so many different definitions of glass, as Aaron alluded to. But sometimes the notion that glass is a state of matter gets evoked, right? And so when you sit with that notion, and you sit with like your grade school textbook of like, here's a solid and here's a liquid and here's a gas. Like as human bodies, like we know how to do solids and liquids and gases. And like, we know how to interact with them, right? But if you propose to me that something is like in a glassy state, my whole body is just like, what the hell does that mean? How do I pick it up? How do I move it? How do I interact with it? And I think that is the part, like the entire premise of blowing glass for me is like training another person's body to be able to speak to that state of matter. And all we do is like extend that little ride from when the material is hot to cold. Like we just kind of like open up a little window in that space and we like, sustain the heat and do a couple maneuvers with a couple, little pieces of force and nudge here and there. And that's it. We just sort of like ride that cooling curve for like a small little window. And we have this engagement with the material that suddenly gives my body a kinesthetic sense of what it means to interact with the glassy state. And it's like this really beautiful state of being in the world and a really beautiful like way of experiencing like what it is to be a human and understand a material and have empathy for a material and what a material wants to do or doesn't want to do. Even like the degree of tolerance as we bring things down to, like, I'll always tell my beginners, like, yes, okay, like you've done a really great job. And right now your tolerance is like, you can make this wall and it's like a 1/2 inch thick. And in time, like you'll probably bring that down to a 1/4 inch and then an 1/8 inch, and maybe like I'm bringing things down to like a 16th inch or maybe even a 32nd inch tolerance that like I can see and feel with like my eyes and my hands. Like there's no I mean, yes, there's some calipers, but it's a natural and innate and felt knowledge.
See, that wasn't so hard. Come on. Glass is like life.
I want to caveat my background with saying all the glass science knowledge in the world doesn't make you a very good glassblower. Like I cannot willingly translate all of the knowledge I have about viscosity and temperature into the hot shop. I can to a degree, but it only gets you so far. It's not like it helps me, make a crisper wall on my goblets or anything. But it does help. It provides this like holistic understanding that I think is important.
But does blowing glass make you a better scientist?
Yes. That one's yes. That it goes that direction, but not the other, which is hilarious to me. Ding! Arts education is the answer.
And
I got you. I got the plug for you. No problem. No, I realized this really fast when I was trying to intentionally incorporate some scientific knowledge of. I blow glass with a postdoc in our research group. So the two of us are like glass scientists who are also glass blowers, and it's lovely to have these conversations. But, like we can only validate so far because glass blowing is incredibly imprecise from a scientific perspective in terms of composition and temperature and all these other parts. Like the tolerance of the glass piece is incredibly good. But from a scientific perspective, that's the last part we care about. And so like we can't calibrate often the knowledge that we have from the lab into the studio in a perfect like 1-to-1, like I know what this temperature is, I know what this flow rate should be. But it does give you this like insight into that, the elusive material, like Helen said. I think that's a really good description because, glass scientists are still struggling to define the glassy state after hundreds and thousands of years. It's still elusive. Yeah.
The art form seems to me to be about not just the material, but the process by which the material is interacted with. It is the embodied process, which is true of a lot of art forms, that is really what's of interest here and what I feel you have as an educator passed on to Aaron is like what you're after here is a deep understanding of the relationship between material and process and human being who's engaged in that process. And that's the joy of the art form.
Yeah. I mean, I think what you've encapsulated is like the flavor of craft. Like, yes, we're talking about glass, but also true about kind of all the craft disciplines and what it is to know something like kinesthetically and by feel. Even like, God, I was doing like the stupidest thing in my studio. Like I was gluing glass in my studio, which is not like, it's not even hot glass. Like we're talking about like cold glass, but I refrained from delegating this task because the glue up was sort of so detailed. And I was in a time crunch and I was like, I don't have the time to convey to a student the teeny tiny nuances that need to be intact so that, this glue up will be successful. And there's so many like little like accumulations of millions of tiny like stupid details, that ultimately constitute the craft, be it glass, be it gluing cold glass, be it ceramics, wood, whatever. And so I think what you're tapping into, like, yes, is very much so that ideology.
I was going to offer that as a kind of way to wind up this conversation. I would love for each of you to say what you're working on now whether that's an artistic project or a pedagogical project. But just for listeners to get a sense of kind of where you are in the world as they're listening around glass art and the teaching of glass.
I'm in my 4th year of my PhD, so I'm spinning about as many plates as you can without any of them dropping too catastrophically. Sort of the glassiest things I'm working on right now. I'm putting together an article with my advisor on why we can blow glass. That just technically answering that question, why can we blow glass? We got reached out to by a tour guide at the Tacoma Museum of Glass about this question, and so we're putting together a sort of communication both to the scientific community, but we're trying to also put it to sort of the artists and say, hey, does this make sense? Do you buy this? Do you agree to these terms? So that's one thing. The other that's really exciting is Penn State in my research group for glass. We've developed a new lower melting glass composition that also doesn't evolve a lot of carbon dioxide. So it's a very eco-friendly sort of green glass family. And we've had some corporate partners and everything, but my part in this is to develop it for artists to use as a casting material. The lower melting temperatures and everything make like glass casting really, really easy and nice. And so I'm working on developing that and some procedures and practices that would go along with kind of converting to this new glass family.
Wow.
So cool.
Art science at its finest. I mean, that is literally an art science project.
Yeah, my advisor goes like, I have this idea and I don't think there's anyone else that should do it or could. So have fun.
It's so awesome. I'm so happy you're in that space because the field needs it so desperately, you know. I have a number of fires going, but I'll speak to the one that I'm trying to get to, which is the most far-fetched. But my goal is to replicate the tuned mass damper from the Taipei 101 skyscraper in America at 1-to-1 scale in hopefully transparent gold glass.
Wow.
So that's the what with no explanation of the why.
How big is 1-to-1 scale?
18 feet in diameter.
Okay.
Yeah, I haven't given up on the 1-to-1 scale yet. So we'll see how that goes.
Now, does that mean, but it shouldn't be 18 feet high also, right? Because I've just learned it's supposed to be wider, or maybe that's just for a cup. I guess that's different.
It's a sphere. The one in Taiwan is a sphere. Yeah, unlike most.
I learned one thing and it was wrong. I tried.
That's the surprising thing of glass. Yeah.
Well, it's an approximate sphere.
I know that we probably should wrap up, but can you say a little bit about why? Because I'm fascinated by why, especially because of how much why matters to you as an artist.
I'm thinking about diasporic identity and what it is for people to relate to, like a homeland or, you know, the trajectory of one's bloodline. And I'm riffing a little bit off of some narratives of antipodes or false impressions of antipodes. An antipode being like two opposing points of the globe, like North and South Pole. But there are like two cities in the US that were named after like sort of supposed antipodes. Canton, Ohio, and Pekin, Illinois were named because they like made up this narrative that they were on the exact opposite side of the globe.
Which is wrong.
Which is totally wrong and hilarious. And there's all sorts of like, you know, historical, wildly racist legacies of their school mascot and such. But I thought it would be lovely to, the Taipei 101 actually, in my case, like that actually was built in like my family's sort of home neighborhood in Taiwan. And I was like, it would be great for me to have like a false antipode that was like accurate to my own personal trajectory. And then in doing so too, I think it will double kind of as like a globe so that other people can cite through this volume their own bloodlines, like historical trajectory through the world to kind of acknowledge that the psychological journey of a bloodline traveling, across the world is different than the physical journey. It's not by land, by sea. It takes a really different journey that's harder to quantify. And the hope being that like the ability to like cite that passage is a way of just acknowledging that disparity.
Wow. That sounds phenomenal. I cannot wait for where that is going to live in a gallery in somewhere in the world.
Yeah, TBD.
Or
We have to like get to the
TBD.
making it part first.
Well, with that mass of glass, I can see some maybe technical problems that could come up.
Well,
I know a
and
guy.
in the world of mentorship through the air, I just want to end by saying I think both of your whys seem grounded in identity and, family and bloodlines. And I'm not saying, it's directly because, Aaron learned from you, Helen. But I do believe in that what we take from our experiences with mentors is often echoes of practice and echoes of why we do what we do. And so it is actually quite lovely to hear that there is an echo of that interest in, identity and embodiment and lineage in Aaron's work as much as it's present in yours.
Totally.
Alec, I have 3 things I want to say. I know we usually keep our 3 things till the end, but I want to start with 3 things, and I'm curious after each if you have a reaction or a response to...
Or a snarky comment. Yes,
or
go.
a snarky
I
comment.
know what my
Those
job
are
is.
always welcome. First, I want to go back to a nerd bomb that I dropped in the interview that I think I didn't explain very well, but I think is really important to the way that Helen and Aaron talk about their work, which is this notion of what I call meta-representational competence. And I want to describe that a little better and say why I think it's so important. So representational is a focus on the relationship between the tools of the art-making genre. So in their case, right, it's the different ways you can work with the glass form, the colors that you mix in, the other objects. Aaron talked about putting other objects into glass. Helen talked about making a gigantic sphere that represents the globe. So all of these tools and how those tools help you to share the concept or idea. So how tools help you represent a concept. And the meta part is a fancy way of saying an awareness that that's what you're doing. Mm-hmm. And the reason I think that is such an important concept in these conversations, but in learning in general, is I think that's the whole ball of wax in terms of learning. Doesn't matter what content area you're in. The game is, how do the tools of your discipline, whether those are numbers and equations and diagrams, or whether they're scenes and dialogue and, if you're directing, lighting and sound, how those tools offer you the opportunity to share the bigger idea that you're hoping to share with your work, with people who care about that thing. So to me, that's everything. That's what it means to be good at something, is to understand how the tools of that thing let you express something to some other group of people who cares about that thing. And for me, Aaron and Helen had the clearest examples and articulations of how that works in their very specific arts practice.
It's also, I think, when you have the notion of that meta awareness, it's very helpful in the world of feedback and dialogue and criticism about the work. That is, if I'm directing something, I would much rather have someone in the process of it. I'd rather have them talk to me about how I'm working with actors or how we have designed the set or what story the light is telling, what story the music is telling, than their experience of the show. Because that's helpful too. But I like to take the step back and look at the building blocks of it. Once it's out there, once the work of art is produced, as the creator of it, it's not really yours anymore. Then it's just everyone's. And then you're mostly talking about the thing. But yeah, and certainly in a world like this, where, I mean, not everyone can talk about their art form with such specificity as they can. So I definitely dug that.
Well, and I think Helen pointed out several times, right? This is a tradition of learning about glass through an academic lens, right? And so she was very careful to say, like, this is probably not how this goes in a glass manufacturing studio where you're producing 200 goblets at a time where they all have to look the same, but rather in a space where it's expected that you're doing this back and forth between technique and concept.
One thing.
Oh.
Two.
Okay, here's my second thing. I was really fascinated by this emerging, I called it mentorship through the air, this emerging idea that they both have a conceptual focus on family histories and personal identities and intergenerational lineage. Both of them talked about how those themes are a big part of their practice as glass artists. And again, Helen was very humble, but I do think that coming through someone's studio in that way, it has to influence the way that you think about conceptually what you care about as an artist. And Aaron's interest in representing family histories and identities, it cannot be an accident that he came through Helen's lab and that's a thing that he was interested in.
Right. Yeah, I guess it goes a long way to when I think about my directing mentors, cold, mean people. I have nothing to say. I just like making jokes. So, but yes, I think the type of mentor you have, what is important to them,
yes,
probably filters through you, or maybe you respond against it. Maybe you go, I don't want to be that way. I'm going to be this other way. But I also think that your mentors are also just your influences as an artist, right? Other artists who maybe you don't actually work with next door, but you enjoy their work in one way or another, and what's important to them probably filters through to your work as well.
And that's why I kind of called it mentorship through the air, right? Which is because it wasn't directly like, this is what I make art about, and therefore this is what you should make art about. It's more, this is what's in the ether of what it means to make work in this studio. And so you sort of absorb it in the way you absorb whatever else is in the atmosphere at the time.
Right. Two.
Third thing that struck me was both of their discussion of what they do as craft rather than fine art. And I just, in terms of arts education and in terms of, I don't know, thinking about what else this kind of work might be like, I was sort of interested in this concept of like, what makes something craft art versus fine art? And I think there's a kind of DIY, this is passed on through generations. It has less, not fewer rules, although Helen did talk about how, you ask like, where does that rule come from? That thinner is better, or this is better, right? And she sort of said, well, it kind of comes from these more academic traditions of quality. So I don't know. I don't have anything profound to say. I just thought it was interesting because we haven't really on this show talked much about the concept of craft art and craft arts as a space where arts education happens.
Right. I guess I picture craft art rooms to be, filled with sawdust and they're messier and you're wearing a smock. And then fine art is you maybe can have a little martini, a little glass, a little something along while you're doing it because I'm making all these things up. I have no idea.
Also, you do not want to have a martini in your hand while you're blowing glass. That would not be a good idea.
I guess not. Well, it's funny, Erica. For our 3 things game today, I was going to say, what are 3 things that stuck out at you about this podcast? So you've already done them.
Great.
And as we've been going for a while. Let's go right to our final 3 things,
yes.
which I'll ask you about again for fear that I won't remember them, which is what are 3 ways that people can connect with our show?
Yes. Well, first of all, you can subscribe to the podcast.
Yes. One thing.
So that it comes into your feed every week. Now
Yes.
we're releasing new episodes every week. We are always on, and we are super excited by all these conversations we're having about arts education with mentors and artists. You already said 1.
I said 1. God.
Yeah, I know.
I already forgot it once. Don't make me do it again.
Also, you should rate our podcast.
2.
I'm not doing a very
you were
good
done.
job
It was
with
rate
this.
and review. This is terrible. Keep going.
Rate and review. And as Alex says, you want it to be 5 stars.
You do.
I mean, if you want to give us less than 5 stars, you can, but we prefer the 5. And what's the third thing? The third thing is you should leave a review.
Man. Oh, leave a review.
Right?
For this week, leave a review, please.
Leave a review. That helps us get to the top of the totem pole so that more people can hear these incredible stories of artists and their mentors.
3 things.
Onward together.